Love Beyond the Stars, the forgotten story of a man and an alien woman. Welcome back to Sci-Fi Nebula. Tonight, I'll tell you a story that begins in the ruins of a forgotten world and ends in the quiet triumph of two souls who found each other when the galaxy itself had turned against them. This is not just a tale of survival, it is a story of love beyond the stars. Chapter 1, Under the Ashen Skies of Orion Dust Belt. The Orion Dust Belt was the kind of place the galaxy itself had already forgotten. Once, it had been alive with the hum of drills, with lights of mining rigs piercing the red dust storms, with corporate banners promising prosperity. Now it was nothing but a graveyard of rusted machines and hollow promises. The air carried the bitter tang of metal. The winds howled through the carcasses of collapsed tunnels. Radiation scars striped the surface like old wounds that would never heal. And yet, in that wasteland, one man lived. Kale Draven. To some, just a name without weight. To others, if they still remembered, a war veteran who had fought on too many worlds for too many flags. A man who had once carried out orders in battles that burned across the void, who had seen men vaporized into shadows on walls, who had buried comrades under alien suns. Now he was nothing more than a recluse. A ghost living in a metal outpost stitched together from broken modules, its power flickering, its walls groaning every time the storm screamed outside. But Kale did not mind. Silence suited him. Silence did not betray him. Silence did not remind him of promises broken. That evening, as twin suns sank low and the horizon bled into crimson haze, Kale drove his rover across the barren flats. The vehicle's wheels ground against gravel, its engine coughed with age. He was returning from scavenging, old capacitors, a few ration packs from a derelict container, and some fuel rods that might last the month if he was careful. Another day in the routine of a man who had chosen exile over company. Then he saw it. At first, it was nothing more than a shape half buried in dust near the edge of a collapsed pit. A bundle of cloth, maybe. An abandoned tarp. Debris. The Orion winds carried trash for miles, Kale was used to it. But then, something shifted. Just barely. Like a twitch. His instincts sharpened, the same way they had in the war when spotting movement meant life or death. He brought the rover to a halt, stepping out into the grit-laden wind. Each step crunched over shards of glass and metal. He approached slowly, eyes narrowing. It wasn't cloth. It was a body. A girl, or something close to it. She lay crumpled in a torn metallic blanket, her limbs too thin, her skin pale with strange, faint blue veins that pulsed dimly under the surface like buried circuitry. Her lips were cracked, her face streaked with dried blood and dust. Her hair clung to her cheeks in filthy strands. But her eyes opened. They were hollow. Not wide with fear, not narrowed with suspicion. Hollow. Empty. Like someone who had seen the end of themselves long ago and had nothing left to lose. When she spoke, her voice was rough, dry, broken. My body, it isn't mine anymore. They rewrote me. I'm filthy. Inside, and out. The words rasped like sand dragged over metal. Kale stood frozen. He had seen men broken on battlefields, seen prisoners come back from corporate interrogation units, seen soldiers shattered into husks. But this was different. There was something so utterly vacant in her tone that it pierced through the armor he thought he had built around himself. He did not ask who they were. He did not ask what had been done. Her scars told enough. The faint glow beneath her skin was evidence of tampering, of experiments, the kind corporations paid for in silence, the kind governments turned away from because profit always outweighed humanity. For a long moment, the wasteland was quiet but for the whine of the wind. Kale breathed out, slow, controlled. Then, without a word, he pulled off his coat, thick, worn, smelling faintly of smoke and oil, and laid it over her. He stooped, his arms strong but careful, and lifted her as though she weighed nothing. She didn't resist. She didn't even flinch. Her head dropped against his chest, her eyes closing as though finally, at last, she was allowed to stop running. Cale carried her to the rover, set her gently in the seat beside him, and drove back into the storm. Not because he believed himself a savior. Not because he thought this would redeem anything from his past. But because in that moment, in that wasteland of silence, leaving her would have been the one sin even he could not bear. The outpost loomed through the haze, rusted walls, patched panels, a dish antenna snapped in half. Home, if such a word could still apply to him. Cale guided the rover inside, the gates sealing with a screech. He carried her into the main chamber, little more than a storage unit repurposed into living quarters. There was one cot. He laid her there. He filled a tin with heated water, left a clean, though faded, set of clothes, and without speaking, stepped out to the metal steps outside. The sky was bleeding into night, the dust storms painting the horizon with fire. Cale sat, lit an old cigarette stick, and inhaled the bitter smoke. He stared outward at the wasteland, but his thoughts lingered inside. He did not know if she would stay. He did not know if she would live through the night. But he left the door unlocked. People only locked away things they feared losing. Cale had already lost everything worth locking. The night deepened. Orion's winds rattled the walls like whispers of the dead. Cale leaned back, eyes half closed, and thought of the war. Of comrades whose names he no longer dared to speak. Of all the things he had walked away from. When dawn came, and the storms quieted, he rose expecting nothing. But when he opened the door, she was there. Sitting in the corner of the warehouse, curled around an empty supply crate like it was the last soft thing in the galaxy. She looked at him but said nothing. He placed a ration pack on the ground, protein bread, a small can of water. She hesitated, her hands trembling, then took it. She ate slowly, cautiously, as though she had long since learned that food appearing without cruelty was too good to trust. Hours passed in silence. Cale repaired equipment. She watched him, always close, never speaking. Then, as the second night approached, she broke the quiet. "Why didn't you touch me?" Her voice was barely audible, but in the stillness it might as well have been thunder. Cale froze. She was staring at him now, her eyes no longer hollow but sharp, fragile, demanding an answer she seemed terrified to hear. He inhaled, let the smoke drift from his lips, and said at last. "Because no one ever had that right. And I won't be the one to take it." Her lip quivered. Not a cry. Not a scream. Just the faint tremor of a dam holding back an ocean. That night, she did not crawl out to the outer storage bay. She stayed inside, near the warmth of the heating unit, wrapped in the blanket he had left her. Cale did not press. Did not look at her long. He sat outside again, letting the silence stretch. But it was no longer the silence of one man alone. And in that small, broken outpost on the edge of nowhere, two strangers who had lost everything else began to share something neither had expected, the first fragile spark of trust. Chapter 2, Silence in the Metal Shadows. The outpost had always been quiet. Cale had built it from wreckage, welded plates together with his own hands, wired power cells scavenged from forgotten satellites. For years, the only sounds were the hum of generators, the faint hiss of leaking pipes, the occasional scream of a storm clawing at the walls. Now, there was something new inside that silence. Breathing. Soft, uneven. Human, yet not entirely. Cale tried not to think about it as he worked. He dismantled the capacitors he had found, stripping wires, soldering connections. He told himself he was used to company. After all, during the wars, he had spent months in barracks with soldiers. But this was different. The silence between him and the girl was not the silence of comrades. It was heavier, fragile, as though one wrong sound might shatter it into pieces that could never be repaired. The second morning after he had found her, Cale entered the storage bay with 2 metal tins of heated water. The girl, he still did not know her name, sat on the floor near the heater. Her thin fingers traced patterns in the dust as though writing words she could not speak. She lifted her eyes when he placed the tins down, but did not move. "You can clean yourself," Cale said, his voice calm, almost flat. Her gaze lingered on him, unreadable, before she finally reached for the water. She peeled away the filthy blanket, revealing limbs marked with bruises, old scars, and beneath them the faint unnatural glow of veins altered by hands that should never have touched her. Cale turned away, giving her privacy, though the room was too small for true distance. He focused on his tools, on the hiss of his welder, until he heard the faint splash of water, the ragged sigh of someone who hadn't felt warmth in a very long time. When he finally looked again, she was dressed in the clothes he had left, baggy, old, once belonging to a comrade long gone. They swallowed her frame, but she pulled the sleeves tight around herself as though armor. For the first time, she spoke more than a whisper. "Thank you." The words were simple, broken, but they carried weight. Cale only nodded. The days that followed unfolded like fragile glass. She stayed close, always within the outpost, never straying far, but she rarely spoke. She watched him instead. Watched him weld, repair, haul water from the purifier. Her eyes followed his hands, his movements, as though memorizing them. Cale said little. He had never been a man of words, and even less so now. But sometimes, silence said enough. At night, he sat outside under the ash-colored sky, listening to the winds rattle the broken antenna. Inside, she would curl near the heater, her body shivering though the air was warm. Cale did not intrude. He gave her space. He had learned long ago that broken things did not heal when forced. And then, one evening, her voice broke the silence again. "Why didn't you touch me?" Cale's hands froze on the wires he was twisting. Slowly, he turned, finding her watching him. Her eyes no longer hollow, but sharp, full of something he recognized, suspicion. Not of him, but of the universe. Of everything that had ever betrayed her. He didn't answer immediately. He let the silence breathe, let her see that he wasn't afraid of it. Finally, his voice came, steady. "Because no one ever had the right. And I won't be the one to take it." Her lips trembled. She turned away, curling tighter around herself. No tears fell, but Cale saw her shoulders shake just once, the faintest crack in the armor she had wrapped around her soul. That night, she did not move to the outer storage bay where she had spent the first evening. Instead, she stayed in the main room, near the heater, close enough that Cale could hear her breathing. He sat outside again, watching the stars emerge beyond the storms. And though he did not say it, though she would not admit it, something had shifted. On the third morning, Cale found her standing at the small mirror bolted to the wall. Her hair hung in tangled clumps. In her hand, she held a comb he hadn't realized she had found in the supply box. Slowly, awkwardly, she dragged it through her hair, wincing at the knots. Cale paused in the doorway, watching her. He thought of saying something, an offer of help, perhaps, but stopped. She didn't need help. She needed space to reclaim what had been taken. When she noticed his reflection, she froze, her hand still in her hair. Her eyes searched his face, waiting for mockery, or judgment, or something worse. But Cale only gave a small nod and went back to his work. Later, she surprised him by asking, softly, "What's your name?" "Cale." Her lips shaped the word as though testing it. "Lyra." The first truth she had given him. A name. That evening, he cooked a simple meal, beans rehydrated from powder, flatbread warmed over the stove. He set a tin before her. She hesitated, then ate. Not with hunger, but with slow, cautious bites, as though she still expected the food to vanish before she finished. Afterward, she asked another question. "Why do you live here, alone?" Cale leaned back, staring at the cracked ceiling. The question cut deeper than she knew. He could have lied. Could have said he preferred it, that he was running from debts, from the law. But he found himself answering simply. Because silence doesn't betray you. Lyra studied him, her head tilted, her eyes reflecting the heater's glow. But silence doesn't save you, either. The words lingered long after she curled under the blanket. Cale sat awake, staring into the dim red of the heater, realizing he could not remember the last time anyone had spoken to him that way. On the fourth day, something changed again. Cale returned from the water purifier to find Lyra sitting outside the outpost, on the metal steps. She was watching the horizon, where the storms had briefly cleared, revealing the pale arc of a distant planet. Her face was calm, almost peaceful. When he approached, she asked, "Do you ever think about leaving?" Cale glanced at the empty skies. "Sometimes." "And why don't you?" His answer was simple. "Because there's nothing left worth going to." Lyra lowered her gaze. Her fingers traced the metal step beneath her. She whispered something, barely audible. "Maybe there's something now." Cale didn't respond. He didn't need to. The silence between them no longer felt heavy. It felt different. Alive. The outpost was still a cage. The dust belt was still a graveyard. And yet, for the first time in years, Cale felt the faintest shift within himself. Lyra had begun as a shadow, broken and empty. But now, she was speaking, asking, remembering herself piece by piece. And Cale realized that perhaps he, too, had begun to remember something he thought he had buried forever. Hope. Chapter 3, Ghosts of Vega, 7 Outpost. For nearly a week, life inside the outpost fell into a rhythm, quiet, fragile, but real. Cale worked the equipment, patched cracks in the walls, tended to the old rover. Lyra moved in silence, exploring the small corners of her new world. She asked few questions, but when she did, they mattered. It was enough. But Cale knew it couldn't last. Supplies were running low, medicine, food, fuel. Orion Dust Belt could sustain a man who didn't mind hunger, but not two people. And not her. Not Lyra. So one morning, he strapped on his old jacket and checked the charge on his sidearm. He found her near the heater, braiding her hair with fingers that still shook sometimes, but less than before. "I'm going to Vega, 7, he said. "Outpost is short on everything." Lyra looked up at him. She didn't answer. Instead, she reached for a pair of boots she'd found by the door, cracked leather, too big for her feet. She pulled them on without a word. Cale paused. He should have told her no. Vega, 7 wasn't safe. Eyes followed anyone new, especially someone like her. But the way she stood, determined, steady, told him there was no point. She had already decided. He gave a small nod. "Stay close. Keep your head down." The ride across the dust belt was long, rough. The rover rattled over broken ground, storms rising and falling like breath. Lyra sat beside him, silent, her gaze fixed on the endless wasteland. Cale glanced at her only once. Her eyes weren't hollow anymore. They were watchful. Alive. When the outpost finally came into view, it looked like a scar on the horizon. Vega, 7 was little more than a cluster of trade hubs, old cargo ships welded together, neon signs flickering in the dust. But in the dust belt, it was the closest thing to civilization. The moment they stepped onto the metal walkways, Cale felt it, the weight of eyes. Traders in patched suits, mercenaries with rifles slung at their sides, workers with grease-stained hands. All looking. All calculating. Lyra lowered her gaze, moving close behind him. She tried to fold herself smaller, but Cale could see the way her hands trembled. He placed himself between her and the crowd, moving steadily, not rushing, not lingering. Inside the supply depot, he kept his words brief. Fuel cells. Rations. Medical packs. Coins clinked. Boxes were stacked. Transactions done in silence. For a moment, Cale thought they would make it out clean. Then a voice cut through the air like a knife. "Well, I'll be damned." Cale turned. A man stood on the depot porch, broad-shouldered, face red from liquor even though it wasn't yet midday. His eyes fixed not on Cale, but on Lyra. "Look what the galaxy coughed back up," the man drawled. His smile was wide, ugly. Lyra froze. Cale felt the shift in her posture, the way her body went rigid, her breath catching like a snare. The man staggered closer, grinning. "She didn't tell you, did she? We had ourselves a deal. Pretty little thing ran off before payday." Cale's jaw tightened. He didn't move, didn't answer. The man leaned, his stinking breath filling the air. "She belongs to us. Property. You think you can just keep her? You don't know who you're crossing, old man. You don't." The words ended with a crack. Cale's fist slammed into his face with the kind of force only a man forged in war could deliver. The drunkard's boots lifted from the ground, his body crashing into the dust. Blood sprayed from his mouth as he choked on a laugh. "You just made enemies," he spat, grinning through broken teeth. "My brother runs this sector. You'll both be ghosts before the week's out." Cale stood over him, silent, his chest rising and falling steady. Then, his voice dropped low, colder than the wind. "She isn't yours." The crowd had gathered now, eyes wide, whispers passing through them like sparks. But no one stepped forward. No one helped the man. In Vega 7, people knew when not to interfere. Cale turned. "Let's go." Lyra's feet moved before she realized it, following him off the porch, away from the murmuring crowd. Her heart hammered, her throat tight. She didn't speak until they reached the rover, until the outpost lights began to fade behind them. Her voice trembled. "You didn't ask if it was true." Cale glanced at her, his hands steady on the controls. "I didn't need to." Lyra turned her face away, hiding the tears she refused to let fall. That night, back in the outpost, the air felt heavier than before. Cale unloaded the supplies, methodical, deliberate. Lyra sat by the heater, arms wrapped tight around herself, her eyes far away. Finally, she whispered, "It's coming, isn't it?" Cale didn't look up. He only nodded once. "Yeah. It's coming." The silence stretched. Then he poured a drink from a flask, set it on the table. Poured another for himself. They drank without words, the firelight flickering across the scars both carried. Outside, the winds howled across Orion dust belt. But inside, in that fragile silence, two people who had no reason to trust anyone at all began to realize something unspoken. Whatever storm was coming, neither of them would face it alone. Chapter 4, Flight Through the Stars. They left the dust belt before dawn, when the storms were nothing but low, tired breaths dragging fingers across the flats. Cale powered the old ship up in darkness, the hull shivering as systems woke from their long sleep. Lights blinked to life one by one, a constellation of tired indicators stitched across the bridge: fuel, marginal, oxygen, adequate, hull integrity, questionable but holding. It wasn't a perfect ship. It wasn't even a good one. But it was theirs for now, and it would carry them away. Lyra stood at the viewport, arms folded around herself, watching Orion shrink. The dust belt receded into a muted smear of rust and shadow. With a gentle thud, the starlight wraith broke the clouds, slipped past the last scattered satellites, and entered the quiet black that had always terrified and comforted Cale in equal measure. The stars were needles. The dark was an ocean. And somewhere out there, shadows were already turning toward their wake. Cale set the course without asking permission from any beacon or gate. This wasn't a sanctioned flight. It was an erasure. He chose the kind of path that left as small a ripple as possible: old freight lanes, drift corridors, the edges of magnetic fields where sensors glitched. It demanded careful hands and a steady mind. He had both. Lyra stayed at the viewport long after the planet disappeared. When she finally turned, her face was pale with the reflection of distant suns. "How long can we run?" she asked. "As long as we need to," Cale said. "And if they don't stop?" "Then we don't stop." It wasn't comfort. It was truth, and for now, it was enough. The routines of survival built themselves quickly. Cale ran daily checks: pressure, vents, scrubbers, coolant. Lyra moved quietly through the ship at first, like a shadow learning how to be a person again. She learned the layout: the narrow corridor where the floor dipped, the storage locker with the latch that stuck, the small medbay with a cabinet door that refused to close. She touched the metal as she passed, fingers grazing scars in the hull like she was reading a language only she understood. On the second day, Cale found her in the engine room, standing beside the core like it was a sleeping animal. She looked at him carefully, as if seeking permission to exist there. "It hums in two voices," she said. Cale listened. Coolant pump, turbine spin. To him, they'd always been one sound, familiar and forgettable. But now that she'd said it, he could hear it, two tones woven together. He nodded. "Good ear." Lyra smiled, but only for a moment, as if smiling too much might break something fragile in the air. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, revealing the faint blue of her altered veins. They pulsed softly, like bioluminescent threads under skin. She caught him looking and pulled her sleeve down instinctively. Cale looked away as if he hadn't noticed. That evening, he showed her the star charts. Not the polished corporate ones with labels and routes, but the ones Cale had made himself: hand-drawn overlays, old coordinates, rumors turned into vectors. He taught her how to read drift, how to predict sensor sweep cycles, where comm beacons were likely to be blind. Lyra leaned over the console, eyes tracing the lines. "This is how you hid, even when you weren't hiding." Cale considered that. "Maybe." She pointed to a blank patch of black. "And here?" "Here," he said, "no one looks unless they're lost." Lyra's finger hovered over the emptiness as if she could feel the gravity of its solitude. "Then we don't look either." On the third day, the ship's water recycler coughed, hesitated, resumed. Cale knew the sound. He'd heard it on transports with 200 souls sweating panic into recycled air. He went to work with a spanner and a prayer. Lyra arrived without being asked, holding a toolkit like she'd been carrying one her whole life. "Can you pass the filter mesh?" he said. She handed it to him without looking away from the recycler. "This one?" "Yes." "And this valve, if it sticks." "Talk to it nice," Cale said. Lyra blinked, as if he'd told a joke by accident. "Do machines listen when you're kind?" "They don't." "You do." She didn't smile, but her eyes stayed on his a moment longer than necessary. The recycler cleared its throat, then smoothed into a healthy sigh. They stood together, hearing the small miracle of clean water return to the veins of the ship. "Thank you," she said. "For fixing it?" Cale asked. "For letting me," she said. He had no answer for that. He didn't need one. They ate small meals at the galley nook, a laughable word for a shelf and a heating coil. Cale rehydrated stew and warmed flatbread. Lyra cut each piece into triangles like she was building something that could hold shape. She ate slowly, still ready to pull the food back to safety if the universe tried to take it again. Sometimes, between bites, she spoke in another language. Soft syllables, liquid and wind-smooth, a melody too gentle for steel. Cale heard her and said nothing. When the last sound faded, she added, as if embarrassed by the music in her mouth, "A lullaby." "From where?" he asked. She shook her head. "From before." They didn't chase the memory farther. Some things were truer when left at the edge of speech. On the fourth day, the sensor alarm blinked once. Cale was on the bridge before the second blink. Show me, he said to no one, because the ship didn't talk back the way military vessels once had. He read angular drift, compared it to the dead green of the display. A light sector ping, too precise to be an accident, too patient to be mere traffic. Lyra appeared in the doorway, breath held just shy of panic. "They're close?" she asked. "Not yet," he said. "But they're patient." "How patient?" "More than we want them to be." He cut broadcast power, rerouted heat signatures, and let the starlight wraith become colder than space for a long minute. Lyra braced her hands on the back of his chair, her fingers white. The ping swept past, hungry and blind. It moved on. The ship stayed quiet, both of them holding their breath like it would help. Only after the screen exhaled its neutrality did Kale allow the system to warm again. He glanced at Lyra's hands on the chair, at the crescent moons her nails had carved into her palms. He uncurled her fingers gently, one at a time, like a man defusing a warhead. "We're okay," he said. "For now," she answered. He almost smiled. "For now is as good as it gets." Night and day meant nothing, but Kale still dimmed the lights at regular intervals, carving hours into something that felt like a life. In that invented night, the ship became a place of small rituals, Lyra brushing her hair with slow patience, Kale polishing a tool that had long since ceased to shine. Sometimes he told her about places he'd seen, a market that floated on magnetic rails, a moon where it rained copper, a city whose streets changed direction every night so no one could plan a war. He spoke like a man reading an atlas he no longer trusted. "Will we ever see them?" she asked. "I don't know," he said. "Would you want to?" Kale thought of crowds and orders and medals handed out by men who never bled. He thought of fire on oceans and the ash it made of names. "I'd want to see the quiet places," he said. Lyra nodded, as if making a list he couldn't read. "Then we'll find those." On the fifth day, they shared a laugh. It was small, clumsy, unplanned, the kind that changed the pitch of a room for a breath. Kale had misjudged a gravity turn and, for a heartbeat, a packet of flatbread floated between them like a stupid planet. Lyra, surprised, reached out and batted it too hard. It spun, landed squarely against his chest, leaving a smear of sauce that did not belong in space. He looked at the stain. Looked at her. She looked horrified for exactly 1 second and then, like a door unlatched, she laughed. A sudden, quiet, astonished sound. Kale felt something loosen in his chest. A rusted hinge that finally agreed to move. "Emergency rations," he deadpanned, brushing the stain. "Deployed." "Target, neutralized," Lyra said, still half laughing, half shocked she could. The moment passed, but it left a warmth that stubbornly refused to leave. On the 6th day, the pursuit became more deliberate. The pings were no longer casual sweeps but searches, lines cast precisely into the dark. Kale changed vector twice in 2 hours, then again. He pulled the ship into the shadow of a drifting ice moon and let them glide there, a dark seed tucked under a cold leaf. Lyra sat cross-legged on the floor of the bridge, her fingers tracing the seam between plates. "If they find us," she said, not asking if, when, "what will you do?" "Everything," Kale said. She tilted her head. "That looks like nothing until it isn't." He looked down at her. "You're learning." Her eyes met his, steady now. "I'm remembering." A silence passed. Not heavy. Not sharp. A field of quiet where a person could stand and not be alone. On the 7th day, she woke from a dream with a start, breath tight, eyes too wide. Kale was in the galley, he heard the sound without needing to see it. He didn't go to her. He waited. When Lyra stepped into the doorway, she did not pretend. She stood, shivering slightly, and said, "I hate the dark when it pretends to be a room." He poured water, slid the cup across the counter. "Me too," he said. She drank, hands steadying around the metal. "In the cage, they kept the lights bright," she said. Dark was for punishment. But bright meant someone was watching, changing things inside you while they smiled. Kale's throat tightened. Words were useless tools around wounds like that. So he gave her what he could. You control the lights here, he said. Bright when you want. Dark when you want. Or neither. We can leave them soft. She nodded. Soft, she repeated, as if the word were a cloth she could wrap around herself. She moved to the wall switch and dimmed the room until it felt like a dusk that belonged to them. Better? He asked. Yes, she said. Better. When the 8th day came, the starlight wraith slipped from the ice moon's shadow and burned a line through a patch of space that maps forgot. For a while, there was nothing but the hum of a ship that was learning to trust its own heartbeat again. Kale recalculated fuel. We'll need to resupply in 3 jumps, he said. Nothing crowded. We'll find a fringe depot. Lyra nodded. No crowds, she echoed. He looked at her then, at the measured calm on her face, at the way fear had stepped back a pace without ever leaving. He realized he had begun to plan routes not only around danger, but around what might keep the quiet in her steady. He did not say it aloud. He adjusted the trajectory by 1 degree. Stars shifted. Kale, she said. If I asked you to keep going with me, past safety, past logic, would you? He didn't take his eyes off the display. I already am. Lyra watched him for a long time. Then she turned back to the viewport, to the endless black that was not empty at all. Her hand lifted and pressed lightly to the glass, as if greeting the dark as a neighbor rather than an enemy. Then we'll keep going, she said. Until the quiet becomes a place. Kale allowed himself to breathe out, just once. The chase would tighten soon. He could feel it in the cadence of the pings, in the way the dark had started to listen harder. But for now, for this thin slice of time, they were moving, together, toward somewhere that did not yet have a name. The starlight wraith carried them forward. Behind, danger knit itself into a net. Ahead, a patch of space waited with patient indifference. Between them, 2 people charted a course not on maps but in the slow, steady assembly of a life, a comb's careful pull, a shared laugh, a hand uncurled from a fist, a light set to soft. And in that fragile drift, the beginning of love found the smallest, bravest room. Chapter 5, War in the Dark Void. The 7th jump took them into the bones of an asteroid field. Kale had chosen it deliberately, a graveyard of fractured rock circling a dead star, a place where sensors faltered and radio signals scattered into nonsense. It was the kind of labyrinth only a pilot who trusted silence would enter. And Kale trusted silence. The starlight wraith slipped between shadows, its engines throttled low, every movement precise, calculated. Kale's hands rested steady on the controls. He could feel the hum of the ship like a pulse against his bones. Behind them, danger coiled, invisible but certain. He knew they were being tracked. He didn't know how many. Lyra sat at the co-pilot station, her eyes scanning the dark outside. She was quiet, but her fingers gripped the armrest too tightly. She didn't have Kale's soldier calm. She had something else, the raw, trembling focus of someone who had been prey too long and now refused to close her eyes. They're out there, aren't they? She whispered. Kale nodded once. 2 ships. Maybe 3. Not a fleet. They don't need a fleet to finish us. Her throat worked as she swallowed. What do we do? We use the dark, Kale said. His eyes flicked to the radar, where faint blips flickered, vanishing and reappearing like ghosts. And we end this before they decide to end us. Hours passed in silence. The starlight wraith drifted along a spine of rock, its shadow merging with the jagged edge. Kale cut thrusters, letting inertia carry them. The stars beyond were hidden, swallowed by tumbling asteroids the size of mountains. Then, a flash. Not from the stars, not from debris. A burn. Too controlled. Too clean. They're here, Kale said. Lyra leaned forward. She saw it now too, the faint trail of ion engines cutting across the void. One ship, then another, circling like wolves. Kale moved. His fingers danced over controls, activating minds he had scavenged and reprogrammed. Small orbs released into the dark, vanishing like drops into an ocean. He rerouted power, shut down external lights, let the starlight wraith become a shadow among shadows. They'll find us, Lyra whispered. They'll try, Kale answered. His eyes were calm, hard. But out here, patience isn't a weapon. It's a trap. The first mercenary ship closed in, its scanners sweeping arcs of blue across the field. It crept between asteroids, hunting, certain of its prey. And then the trap snapped. The mine Kale had released earlier ignited on the ship's port side. A concussive wave rippled, slamming it into a rock wall. Metal shrieked, sparks flared. The ship spun, crippled, its lights guttering out. Snared, Kale muttered. His eyes flicked to Lyra. One down. But the victory was short-lived. The second ship emerged from the dark, guns hot, firing bolts that streaked past the wraith's hull. The entire ship shuddered under the shock waves. Panels rattled, lights flickered. Kale's hand stayed steady. He rolled the wraith between two tumbling asteroids, letting enemy fire chew into rock instead of steel. He moved like he had in the war, silent, efficient, every instinct awake. Lyra clung to her seat, her chest tight with terror, but her eyes never left him. The mercenary ship was faster, newer. It cut through the debris like a blade, chasing them. Kale veered, dropping another mine, but the pilot anticipated it, swerving wide. Smart bastard, Kale growled. They'll kill us, Lyra said. Her voice shook, but her eyes were steady. Kale shot her a glance. Not if I kill them first. Then came the boarding attempt. The enemy ship closed the gap, a harpoon-like tether shooting across space, clamping into the wraith's hull with a magnetic thud. Lyra flinched at the sound, as though it struck her own body. The tether groaned, pulling the ships closer. Warning alarms blared across the bridge. They're latching. Lyra cried. Kale was already moving. He grabbed his rifle, checked the chamber, and looked at her. His eyes were sharp, but his voice low, steady. Stay behind me. No matter what happens. The airlock groaned. Metal shrieked. And then they were inside. 3 men stormed the corridor, armored, masked, weapons glowing with charge. Their boots rang against the floor. Kale fired first, one shot, clean, dropping the leader before his foot had fully cleared the hatch. The others returned fire. The corridor exploded with light, bolts slamming into the walls. Kale dove behind cover, his rifle barking, precise, controlled. He moved like a man who had done this 1,000 times, because he had. Lyra crouched behind him, her hands over her ears, her heart pounding. She could smell the ozone, feel the heat of energy bolts tearing through the air. One mercenary fell, his chest scorched. But the last one charged, snarling, close enough now that Kale's rifle wasn't fast enough. And in that moment, Lyra moved. She didn't think. She didn't plan. Something deep inside her, the part of her that had been rewritten, remade, answered. Her veins flared blue, light racing beneath her skin. Her hands lifted, trembling, and a surge of energy leapt from her palms, slamming into the mercenary with the force of a storm. His body lifted, crashed into the ceiling, then fell limp, smoke rising from his armor. Silence. Lyra froze, staring at her hands. They glowed faintly, light fading as quickly as it had come. She looked terrified, not of the mercenary, not of Kale, but of herself. Kale lowered his rifle, his breath steady despite the ringing in his ears. He looked at her, really looked, at the blue fading from her veins, at the horror on her face. "You saved us," he said. Her voice cracked. "I don't even know what I am." Cale's eyes softened, just for a moment. "You're alive. That's all that matters." They dragged the bodies into the airlock and released them into the void. The tether snapped, drifting uselessly. The second ship lingered for a time, scanning, but Cale powered down, masking their presence until it gave up, retreating into the black. When silence finally returned, Cale slumped into his chair on the bridge, blood seeping from a graze on his shoulder. Lyra sat across from him, her hands still trembling, eyes wide. "What did they do to me?" she whispered. Cale didn't answer. Not because he didn't know, but because he understood the question wasn't really for him. She looked at him then, her voice breaking. "You killed for me." Cale leaned back, exhaling smoke from a cigarette he had lit with shaking fingers. His eyes met hers, steady. "I live for you first," he said quietly. "The killing comes after." Lyra swallowed hard. The ship was quiet again, but the silence was different now, heavier, charged. She wasn't safe yet. Neither of them were. But for the first time, Cale realized, they were no longer just running. They were fighting. And survival had become something more than endurance. It had become a vow. Chapter 6, A Home Beside a Dead Star. The battle in the asteroid field left more than scorch marks on the starlight wraith. It left silence inside Lyra's eyes, a silence heavier than before. She sat for hours after the fight, staring at her hands as if they no longer belonged to her. Cale said nothing. He cleaned his rifle, patched the hull, reset the ship's systems. He moved like he always did, steady, deliberate. But inside, he carried the same question that haunted her. What had they done to her? They jumped again. And again. Each jump took them farther from known routes, deeper into the forgotten edges of the galaxy. Food dwindled. Fuel ran thin. But Cale had learned long ago that survival wasn't about abundance. It was about knowing when to stop running. On the 12th jump, they stopped. The planet had no name. It wasn't on any chart, not on the corporate maps or the smuggler overlays Cale carried. It was a dead world orbiting the faint glow of a collapsed star, a husk that burned cold. From orbit, it looked broken, craters scarred the surface, dried seas stretched like pale scars, old mining scaffolds rusted into skeletons. But Cale saw what he needed to see, no comm beacons, no traffic, no pursuit. Silence. He brought the wraith down through the thin atmosphere, landing near the remains of an abandoned settlement. The buildings were little more than crumbling shells, but one structure still stood, a storage hall, walls bent but intact. Lyra followed him down the ramp, her boots crunching against dust that hadn't been disturbed in decades. She tilted her head back, staring at the sky. The collapsed star loomed above, faint light bleeding into space, casting everything in shades of silver and shadow. "It's quiet," she whispered. "Good," Cale said. They began to build. The work was hard, but Cale welcomed it. He scavenged plasteel beams from collapsed towers, reinforced the hull's frame, sealed cracks with sheets stripped from the ship's spare panels. Lyra worked beside him, carrying tools, hauling lighter parts, her movements clumsy at first but steadier with each passing day. She learned quickly. How to brace a support beam. How to ignite a plasma torch without burning herself. How to twist wire until the connection hummed with life. Cale never praised, never coddled. He only showed, corrected when needed. And Lyra, for the first time in years, found herself doing more than surviving. She was building. At night, they cooked simple meals on a plasma stove salvaged from the wraith. Thin stew, flatbread, sometimes roasted roots they dug from beneath the dust. The meals were plain, but they tasted like something she hadn't felt in a long time, normal. One night, as the wind moaned outside, Lyra looked at Cale across the firelight. Her hair fell in clean strands now, she brushed it daily with a comb she guarded like treasure. Her face had color again, faint but real. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. Cale raised an eyebrow. "Doing what?" "Building. Staying. Me." For a long moment, the fire popped, the only sound between them. Then Cale said, "Because running doesn't last forever. Because silence isn't enough anymore. And because," he stopped, his voice low, almost lost in the crackle of the fire. "Because you're still here." Lyra lowered her gaze, her lips pressing together. She didn't answer. But her hand lingered near his on the table, close enough that he could feel the warmth. Days passed into weeks. The storage hall became a home. A roof patched against the storms. A bedroll corner. A fire pit that warmed more than just air. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Cale repaired a rain collector from old piping. Lyra tended it daily, checking seals, listening to the gurgle of clean water filling barrels. She smiled once when the first drop splashed onto her palm. She began to hum again, sometimes without realizing. The lullabies of her other life, the language she thought she had lost. The sound filled the hall, soft, strange, haunting. Cale never interrupted. He only listened. And slowly, something shifted inside her. One evening, as the collapsed stars sank below the ridge line, painting the horizon in pale fire, Lyra sat beside Cale near the fire. She stared into the flames, her hands folded in her lap. "The girl who was broken," she said suddenly. Her voice was calm, but steady. "The one who was taken. The one they rewrote. She's gone." Cale didn't speak. He watched her, the firelight flickering against her face. Lyra turned to him, her eyes steady for the first time. "I buried her. What's left is me. And I choose to live." For a long moment, Cale said nothing. His gaze held hers, searching. Then he nodded once. "Then I'm proud to have buried her," he said softly. "And honored to meet the woman sitting here now." Lyra's breath hitched. Not tears, not a breakdown. Just a small smile. A real one. That night, she did not sleep curled away from him. She lay near, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, the fire between them burning low. Cale stared at the cracked ceiling, listening to the wind outside. For years, silence had been his companion. Now, for the first time, silence felt like something shared. And when Lyra whispered, "Thank you, Cale," before sleep claimed her, he let himself close his eyes, feeling a peace he hadn't thought possible. The dead star burned faintly in the sky. The world was still broken, still empty. But in that forgotten corner of the galaxy, among rust and dust, two people who had been torn apart by forces beyond their control had begun to stitch something together. It wasn't grand. It wasn't heroic. But it was life. Chapter 7, Light in the Endless Dark. The world beside the dead star did not change. Its dust storms still howled across the plains, its mountains still crumbled into shadow, and its sky still bled silver light from a sun too tired to burn. But within its silence, something had changed. Cale and Lyra had made a life. The days no longer bled into survival alone. Cale cut wood, repaired walls, patched leaks. Lyra tended to the water barrels, cooked, learned to mend clothing with the patience of someone reclaiming lost rituals. They spoke more often now, though never too much. Their conversations weren't about the past, never about the cages, never about the war, but about the present, and sometimes, just sometimes, about the future. "What would you build?" Lyra asked one evening, "if you could build anything?" Cale thought for a long moment. "A porch. With a chair that doesn't fall apart when you sit on it." Lyra smiled. "And me? I would build a window that showed the stars, even when the storms came. Simple dreams. Fragile. And yet, They carried more weight than anything Cale had once killed or bled for. Months passed. No ships came. No hunters. No signals from the void. Vega 7 and its threats faded into memory, as distant as the war itself. And in that stillness, Cale began to see something he had not believed possible: peace. He saw it in the way Lyra's steps grew lighter, in the way her laughter came without hesitation now, in the way she combed her hair by the fire with patience instead of urgency. He saw it in the small touches, the way her hand brushed his when passing a tool, the way she lingered near him in silence as if silence itself had become a language between them. Cale had never been a man of faith. War had stripped that from him long ago. But when Lyra leaned against him one night, her head resting lightly on his shoulder as they watched the collapsed star fade into twilight, he thought, just for a moment, that perhaps faith wasn't in gods or empires. Perhaps it was in the fragile decision of two souls to keep going, even when the universe had already tried to end them. Lyra changed, but not in ways Cale feared. Her veins still glowed faintly in the dark, a reminder of what had been done. But the glow no longer terrified her. She would hold her hand to the fire, watch the blue pulse against the orange, and whisper, "They don't own this anymore. It's mine." Cale never corrected her. He only nodded. Because she was right. Sometimes, Cale still dreamt of war. He would wake with sweat beading his brow, the phantom sound of gunfire in his ears. On those nights, he would step outside, sit beneath the ash-colored sky, and smoke until the stars steadied. Once, he found Lyra waiting there already. She looked at him, eyes tired but calm. "You hear them too," she said. Cale exhaled smoke. "I hear everything I try to forget." Lyra placed her hand over his, light but steady. "Then we'll remember together. And bury it together." For the first time in years, Cale believed someone. Seasons shifted, or what passed for seasons on that broken world. Dust storms grew colder, nights stretched longer. Cale and Lyra added layers to their shelter, a thicker roof, stronger walls. They lived not as fugitives, not as survivors, but as something more dangerous, as people who hoped tomorrow might exist. And one evening, as the last light faded and the fire cracked low, Lyra spoke words Cale never expected to hear. "Do you ever think," she asked, "that we don't need the galaxy to know our story? That surviving it is enough?" Cale stared at the fire. He thought of Vega 7, of mercenaries bleeding into the dust, of Lyra's trembling voice when she said she was filthy inside and out. He thought of his own hands, scarred from 1,000 battles fought for nothing. And then he looked at her. "Yes," he said. "Surviving is enough. Maybe that is the story." Lyra smiled softly. "Then let it stay here. Between us." And Cale, for the first time since he had walked away from the war, smiled back. They never returned to town. They never answered the galaxy's questions. Sometimes the world doesn't need your story. Sometimes it only needs you to keep breathing, to keep living, to prove that light can exist even in the endless dark. For every man who turns his back on what's right, there is another who still knows when to act. For every woman broken by cruelty, there is still the chance for her to rise, to claim her life back. And for every world that dies, there is still a corner of the galaxy where love can take root. Cale and Lyra had found that corner. And they chose to stay. If this story stirred something in you, if it made you believe that even in the coldest, darkest corners of the galaxy, two people can still find each other and build something worth living for, then subscribe to Sci-Fi Nebula. Out here among the stars, there are always more stories waiting to be told.